Game of Thrones Season 8 wasn't the true end of the story. At least not for Daenerys Targaryen. Now, believe it or not, the TV show was more like a Cliff Notes version to the actual story, which is yet to be concluded. In this video, I want to discuss what exactly is going to happen to Daenerys Targaryen in Winds of Winter. Now, before we get started, please do me a massive favor and slap a like on this video. The like goal is going to be 100. Also, and this is the most important part, please make sure you're subscribed and then have your notifications turned on so that way you get alerted every single time I drop a video throughout this long night in the wait for House of the Dragon. Also, consider checking out my Patreon link down below in the description if you want to show some support. Now, this is a bit of a refresher course. For everyone who's unaware, Daenerys in Game of Thrones Season 5 is pretty much, at the end of that, is pretty much where she's left off in the books. All of what happens when she goes to Vaz Dothrak and burns down the hut with all the cows in it and comes out with titties barren. Excuse me, I actually mean titties blazing. But all that, along with this massively inspiring speech that she gives at the end of Season 6, hasn't exactly happened yet and most likely won't go down exactly that way in the books. Now, the last we hear from Daenerys in Dance is kind of similar to what happens on the show, but not really, as they've excluded most of the awesome characters. One of them being Strong Belwas, who is a large black man who comes into Daenerys' Queen's Guard after he is sent by Illyrio Mopatis to go and sort of protect her. Sir Arstan the Bold, or Barristan Selmy, is his squire, and he travels alongside Strong Belwas to go and meet up with Daenerys. Now, just so you can get the picture of this dude, just for the hell of it, this guy is pretty much like a Debo from Friday. He's like 3 times the size of Daenerys, and Daenerys actually describes him as being like 21 stone, which is a solid 294 pounds in like modern day weight. So anytime something is described by stone in the books, you can sort of just multiply it by 14 to get the weight in actual pounds. But either way, this dude is pretty solid. He's a bit of a monster, and he's described as like, he tells everyone he's never lost a fight. And one of the things he does when he gets into a fight is let his opponent scar him one time. Basically, he allows them to get one cut off and then he brutally murders them. For instance, there's a scene in Game of Thrones, I think it's Season 5, when Daario challenges a champion of one of the cities that Daenerys is trying to conquer over in Essos. I think it's Meereen, I'm not really sure, but that scene goes down in the books, and it's actually with your boy Belwas Strong. Now, he ends up injuring the opponent's horse much like Daario does, but instead he allows the guy to cut him in his gut to prove that, you know, he's about to murder him, and then he ends up cutting off his head and then literally shitting on top of his body in front of the entire city. It's a pretty intense scene. Now, what's interesting is, just to give you a little bit more insight to how Daenerys is in the books, there is something similar that happens in Game of Thrones Season 5 where she sort of goes through who she should have fight this guy, the champion of the city, and she goes through all of them and decides that Daario would be someone that she could risk losing if he were to die. She says, Barristan, you know, I need you. But in the books, that's Belwas, and Daenerys decides that the death of a slave wouldn't really hurt her, and that if the city's champion were to die by a slave, that's even more of an insult. So Daenerys is a bit more ruthless and cutthroat in the books. Every character is, to be honest. But just getting back on track here, Daenerys, her last few chapters culminates in her arriving at the fighting pits. And when she first gets there, she is told by Hizdar Zolarak that the honey locusts that Strong Belwas are eating are pretty good and maybe she should try them. Later on, Strong Belwas is poisoned, and it's because of those honey locusts. So Daenerys decided that she didn't want them because she doesn't like spicy food, but that's also a plus because she doesn't get poisoned. Now, before I go any further, I'm actually going to suggest that you go watch one of the videos I did on the 3 major differences between Tyrion Lannister book and show. Now, in that video, I describe what's going on with Tyrion in his last Dance of Dragons chapter, and he's in the fighting pits in Meereen, and this sort of ties in with what I'm about to say with Daenerys. So Daenerys notices that there are 2 dwarves that are fighting. One's on a dog and one's on, I think it's a lion, but that's actually Tyrion Lannister and Penny, and she's told by Hizdar that they're about to get eaten by lions. This is when Daenerys decides, hey, hold the fuck up. The other fighters who that happened to sort of agreed to it, but these dwarves didn't. So she calls a stop to it and ends up actually saving Tyrion Lannister's life. Now, like I said, she doesn't know it's Tyrion, but Tyrion knows it's her. And it's interesting because before this point, Tyrion had never actually seen Daenerys, and he has this image built up of this marvelous mother of dragons, this sort of queen with this like flowing silver hair, and he sees her and he realizes that she's just a scared little girl. And before I get roasted down in the comments, the dwarves arrive riding a dog and a pig. It's not a lion, like I mentioned. Now, after she saves Tyrion and Penny's lives, this is where everything sort of comes to a head. That's cleared, and then next comes out as a fight between a girl and a boar. And what happens is the boar splits the girl from the knee to the crotch, and when doing so, knocks her down and starts ripping out her entrails, and like there's guts everywhere and blood and all this stuff. And this is when Drogon flies into the pits. As soon as Drogon lands, he actually kills the boar who just killed Barcena, and he ends up eating her as well. So Drogon is like full on eating people in the books. Now the fighting pits actually has about 20,000 people in it, so obviously there are some spearmen who immediately jump on the scene and try to take out Drogon. Well, this does not go well. Drogon snaps their spears, breaks their necks, and eats them as well. Although, to be fair to the spearmen, one of them is able to get a spear right on Drogon's neck. Dany then sees all this, deciding that she wants to leave. She goes down and attempts to approach Drogon, afraid for her life that the dragon's not going to recognize her. He actually breathes flames at her, attempting to, burn her, but she rolls out of the way. She ends up taking her whip, which is a thing in the books, and she starts trying to mount him. She basically whips him a few times, and he's not really having it. And finally, she's able to mount him, and they sort of fly off, and that's where, we end up with her last chapter. Or sort of in the show where she's, surrounded by that Khalasar and taken to Vaz Dothrak. That's the last we hear from her in the books. Now, what actually happens is kind of similar to what they showed on the show, but after she flies off like a crazy far distance with Drogon, they end up going back to his lair. Now, she ends up getting sick on the way and comes down with something that may suggest she has something called the bloody flux. Now, I'm not going to describe it in detail here, but just imagining the worst diarrhea and bleeding in that area that's sensitive and all that stuff. The worst thing you could ever imagine, that worst type of sickness. This happens to Daenerys. And while she's just sort of laying in the grass, she starts having visions. One of these visions is of Quaithe. Another one is Viserys Targaryen, her brother, who got the golden crown, both books and show, and another one of Jorah. But without getting into too much detail, because we all know that dreams and prophecies can sort of lead to a whole nother video, perhaps I will be doing in the future. But just to summarize, the main idea of all of those visions is that she kind of has to forget who she is in order to become something else. Now, after the vision, she starts to get a little better, and she tries to get Drogon to take her back to Meereen, but he's not having none of that. So she ends up sort of just leaving him and starts walking south back towards Meereen. And when she does this, she notices there's a single Dothraki scout off in the distance, but the scout doesn't actually see her. He's just kind of headed towards her, and she immediately calls out for Drogon. The scout sees Drogon and begins to flee, but Drogon picks him up and then starts eating his horse. Daenerys joins him in that feast of horse, and this is when Khal Drogo, who is a blood rider of Khal Drogo, or he was a co-rider, which is basically like a commander in his Dothraki armor, this is how he finds Daenerys, and this is the last we hear of her in Dance of Dragons. Now, as far as my predictions for wins, let me backtrack a bit before I get to what I think will happen to Daenerys. Now, I mentioned that Strong Belwas actually eats the bowl of honey locusts that Daenerys is encouraged to eat by his Darzola Rock. Well, I mentioned they were poisoned, and after Daenerys sort of disappears on Drogon, Sir Barristan Selmy has a bit of a finding out. He becomes a detective and realizes that the confectioner who actually made the poisoned honey locusts was a cat's paw. He was working for his Darzola, and this person actually names Hisdar as the person who forced him to poison the honey locust because Hisdar had his daughter. Now, he obviously did this, and Daenerys was able to get away. Strong Belwas survives the poisoning, and he thinks it's mainly just because he's so fat, but the whole scene in the pits at Daznak was a setup. And as Daenerys is riding in that grass that I mentioned earlier, when she's poisoned and she's vomiting profusely, she's having these visions and she thinks she's gonna die. She's thinking who could have sort of set her up, and when doing so, she thinks that she might die right there, and the ghost Khalasar will come and take her, and he can ride in her starry Khalasar in the Nightlands with Khal Drogo. She mentions that her bones will become feast for carrion crows and wolves. Now, I should just mention this real quick because I haven't been too clear on it. Dany actually gets sick from drinking river water. water. Tyrion actually mentions that people who do drink the water get sick. So Daenerys does this, and in doing so, she gets sick, and she thinks she has bloody flux or the pale mare. But getting back on track here, the quote from the books reads directly that, "If I stay here, I will die. I may be dying now. Would the horse god of the Dothraki part the grass and claim her for his starry Khalasar, so she might ride the Nightlands with Khal Drogo? In Westeros, the dead of House Targaryen were given to the flames, but who would light her pyre here? My flesh will feed the wolves and carrion crows," she thought sadly, "and worms will burrow through my womb." Her eyes went back to Dragonstone, which she's obviously this part isn't in the books, but Dragonstone is what she refers to as Drogon's lair. It looks smaller. She could see smoke rising from its wing-carved summit miles away. Drogon has returned from hunting. Just as a side note, when I was reading that part in Dance of Dragons, it kind of reminded me when Drogon flies back to pick up Daenerys' body, like right before he burns the Iron Throne to the ground. But the interesting part is that she said her body will be food for the wolves and the carrion crows. And the only character who's ever been described as a carrion crow in the books is Jon fucking Snow. And he's the one who kills her in the TV show. In the books, Tormund is the one who refers to Jon as a turncloak, a carrion crow. Basically, the first chance he gets, he's gonna betray them. Now, remember what I mentioned about Daenerys earlier when she's lying there dying, having visions about basically in my opinion, after reading about those, I think the main point of all these visions is that she's going to take a drastic step in the Winds of Winter. She's going to do things quite differently than how she did with Dance, where in A Dance with Dragons, where she tries to do things the right way. She tries to be a good leader. She frees the slaves. She's all about conquering people, but doing it in a way in which not that many lives will be lost. And while she's having those visions, she realizes that that way of doing things isn't working. It's sort of a lot more clear in the books that there's a way bigger chance that she's going to take a turn for the worse in the Winds of Winter. It kind of makes sense as she's lying there thinking about how she's going to die, and she mentions that, her death is going to be food for the carrion crows and the wolves, which we all know wolf for House Stark. Jon Snow is the white wolf. We know that this sort of alludes to the fact that her death will allow Jon Snow to sort of come into his own, and I predict that something similar will happen in Winds of Winter or in A Dream of Spring. After Daenerys finally makes her way to Westeros, which I feel like is going to be a lot quicker in Wind, she's going to make snap decisions. She's fully embraced fire and blood at this point in the books. She's going to quickly make her way to Westeros, and this will lead her ultimately into the path of Jon Snow, where he will be inevitably resurrected. In Winds of Winter, I think there's a strong chance that Daenerys and Jon Snow will have a love affair, and this will lead to, in A Dream for Spring, when he does kill her, that moment will be so much more satisfying. Now, one thing in particular that I think a lot of people sort of agree with is when Daenerys does finally, after she's done doing what she may do in Vaz Dothrak, if she ends up going there in the books, and she heads back to Meereen and finds, the city surrounded, I think that will be like a true fire and blood moment in the books. I think she's going to fly on the back of Drogon. The other dragons will have been freed, and she's just going to roast everyone outside the city and maybe even kill some innocents. That moment in the books may be a bit like the show's version of King's Landing, where she sort of roasts everyone alive because she's fully embraced fire and bloods, and it will be more spelled out that her path to becoming the Mad Queen is a lot more of a thing. I think in the books, there's a chance that she could possibly turn in the last seconds in A Dream of Spring when Jon does assassinate her. He only does so and realizes in the last seconds that he's making a terrible mistake. But I feel like that's a good point to wrap this video up. If you all want me to do more of a super focused prediction video of Daenerys and Winds, where I don't sort of have to recap her last few chapters of Dance, which took up a large part of this video, let me know down below in the comment section, and also let me know what you think Daenerys will be doing in Winds of Winter, and if you think she will eventually become the Mad Queen, being killed by Jon Snow. Alright, I want to thank you all so much for watching. If you could please slap a like on this video. The like goal is going to be 100, and also this is the most important part. Please make sure you are subscribed and have your notifications turned on, so that way you get alerted every single time I drop a video throughout this long night. Super special shout out to every single member of my Patreon family over on patreon.com/SirHuntsReviews, and a super special thank you to every single person who watched this video. I want to give you all so much a massive shout out, and I want to thank you all so much for watching. My name's Mark, and this has been Sir Hunt's Review.